Emily, can you raise your hand? We both made matching backgrounds, so it was easier to spot us. So that's a little change since last time. But we are the co-founders of Institute Play, and with Institute Play, we want to be a women-led community-based educational platform, and that's a mouthful and a handful. But what we aim to do is to translate the latest scientific research on specifically female health and psychology and leadership into actual practical strategies that we can use. Our main focus for now is starting to understand the specific female stress cycle and do this from 3 different levels: on a biological perspective, psychological perspective, and a physiological, so that, let's face it, women are the percentage of, between men and women burn out faster, and we really want this to see reduced, and that's a part of our mission. So for that, we have developed a speaker series, and we're very excited to talk to you about mental health, contraception, and hormones, the follow-up from the talk we had last week. And how this hour is going to work, if you're here for the first time, it's a very conversational format, and we love to see the chat active, questions if you want to share your stories and your experiences. And keep your questions, because at the last 10 minutes, we're going to open the floor for you guys. So to get us started, who do we have with us today? And our expert is Annemarieke Dornwerd. She's a biopsychologist and has recently received her doctorate in experimental and clinical psychology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands for her dissertation titled Hormone Heroines, an ode to the hormonal woman. I couldn't think about a better title to give that, Annemarieke. So
thank you.
Warm welcome. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Lovely to be here.
I see Christina. Hi, Christina. This is your first. Is it your first session with us live?
Yes, the first one.
Amazing. So let's kick off straight away. We have an hour. Annemarieke, can you talk us a little bit through the 4 stages of the monthly cycle? We're gonna dive straight in, explain how hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, testosterone influence us, not only our mood, our well-being, but our energy levels at each stage.
Yeah, all right. We'll dive straight into biology and the neuroscience. So broadly, I think everyone has heard of the 2 stages, right? So you have the first half of your cycles being the follicular phase, the second half of your cycle being the luteal phase. I think most of them have heard those. But as we've also talked about, there's a lot more nuance within those cycles as well. There can be 4 cycle phases, but you can also divide them into many more, actually. And so your cycle starts at the first day of your period. When you're bleeding, that's when the follicular phase starts. And your brain basically signals to your ovaries to start producing a follicle. So it ripens, and that actually starts producing estrogen. So that rises during the first half of your follicular phase. And once it reaches a threshold, then it signals basically to have ovulation. So an egg is released from that follicle. That ovulation happens, estrogen peaks. You feel great. I'll explain a bit more about why that is after. So once that ovulation has happened, the follicle remains that are left over from the corpus luteum, which starts the luteal phase. That's kind of where the name, you can match it. And that leftover kind of produces this progesterone and estrogen. So that's when you see progesterone mostly rises in your second phase of your menstrual cycle. It peaks, it's what I like to call a mid-luteal phase, and then it drops to estrogen and progesterone. So that's the premenstrual week that many of us experience symptoms during that week. So what actually happens and how you can kind of explain how your mood changes, how your energy changes, how your productivity even changes is tying it back to what those hormones do. So we kind of reduce these hormones often to this very reproductive functioning, right? So it's like, it's good for fertility in men, both in women, but they have receptors, which means this kind of key and lock system. So they have these locks that they act on all over the body. I'm always saying, if you look at what a pregnant person, the changes they go through physically and internally kind of shows you a wide range of effects that hormones have, right? And what I think is really cool as a neuroscientist is that they also have these effects on the brain. And they can have these direct effects on the brain, so it actually changes your structure and your functioning. So there's these really cool studies from, for example, Santa Barbara, where they put people in a scanner every day of the month, and you do see that your brain changes in structure and in function. And they also have these indirect functions. So they work on these chemicals called neurotransmitters, and everyone has kind of heard of them, right? So the serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. So it's all these hormones that work on your mood, they work on your energy levels. For example, oxytocin is this cuddle and love hormone, so it works for your interaction with other people. And what we know, for example, for the drop of these hormones in your premenstrual week is when most 70% of menstruating people notice one or two symptoms from this, is that when these hormones drop, actually your levels of dopamine drop and your serotonin system changes. And for example, serotonin has a lot to do with your mood, so you can start to feel more down. You can even have some depressive symptoms, some anxiety. But serotonin also works on your appetite. It works on your sleep, so you can have reduced sleep quality, but you can also have these weird carb-heavy cravings that many of us notice. And you can all tie that back actually to the neuroscience of it all. But that also means that when your hormone levels rise in your follicular phase, that means your dopamine levels increase and your serotonin signaling gets better. So that means you have more energy, you feel more social. During ovulation, for some people, your testosterone even increases, and that has a lot to do with your reward system. So you go out and you experience it, and you have more energy to socialize, and you feel more reward from engaging in those activities. It's kind of a short, very dense version of hormones.
I love it. You took us on a deep dive, so everybody pay attention for the biology lesson. And let's just get a feel for what is happening with the women in this room. I'm quite curious to hear which one of you is currently tracking their menstrual cycle. Okay, so we've got pregnant ladies in the room. That's a whole hormonal cocktail. Then two who are actually tracking. Okay, beautiful. And do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, sure.
Then I always track it as well.
Yeah, it's actually such an important information that I know that we're taking questions at the end, but maybe there is one or two questions that you guys have right now, because this is so fundamental to know. Okay, you can put it in the chat and we can address them later as well. The next one, because we're talking about contraceptives, how they affect our systems from hormonal standpoint.
So you have, of course, I'm talking about the viewpoint from the Netherlands here, but I think worldwide the oral contraceptive pill is one of the most popular hormonal contraceptives. What that does is basically its whole functionality is to prevent ovulation, to prevent fertilization of the egg, and to prevent pregnancy. And how it does that is basically by taking this pill every day that actually contains synthetic versions of estrogen and progesterone, so the hormones that fluctuate throughout your cycle. And by doing that, the brain basically gets a signal, well, actually there's enough of these hormones in your system already, we don't need to produce them. So it kind of levels out all the changes throughout your cycle that I mentioned before, and it provides this more stable version of your hormone levels. So you don't have the peak of ovulation and you can't get pregnant in that way.
That's a really good explanation. Hormonal contraceptive, oral hormonal contraceptives suppress both estrogen and progesterone.
So you do have oral contraceptive pill, which does reduce both estrogen and progesterone. So basically these signaling molecules from your brain don't really make a difference between estrogen and progesterone in that sense. They're kind of the same precursors to that. So the oral contraceptive pill contains both of them, but other types of contraceptives are often progestin only. So these synthetic forms of progestin. So you have the hormonal contraceptives, the IUD, the implant, all those types of stuff often only contain progesterone, and they have less of an effect on your natural hormone, so the suppression of that's not the main mechanism, right? So they don't suppress ovulation, or at least as much compared to the oral contraception.
Yeah, because the next question is how oral contraceptive compared to IUD implants, injections in terms of hormonal impact.
Yeah, so the idea here is when we focus on this IUD is that there is this more localized release of hormones. So it's placed in the cervix, and in that sense it's always thought to be a more localized release of hormones. On the one hand it is, and it's a much lower dose, but I always say there's no such thing as a localized effect of hormones, right? You can't pick and choose which receptor they bind to, because it does still get into your bloodstream. And we do actually see from research that it does affect, for example, how your brain responds to stress. And that's an indication that it's not just a localized effect, but it is actually a centralized effect as well.
And is that because the estrogen, with the contraceptives, the estrogen is being suppressed and estrogen effects or counteracts with the cortisol, or maybe there's something else?
Well, that was an example for the hormonal IUD. So that is because of the synthetic progesterone. And then the oral contraceptive pill has both synthetic estradiol and progesterone. And the complicated factor there is that it doesn't just have an effect on your natural hormones, but we know that these synthetic versions actually have a higher binding affinity to these locks than the natural versions of them. So they have an effect that is basically more, if they're in competition, the synthetic hormones will win. We don't really know what the effect of that is yet.
That's really fascinating. We have a question from Jen, and she's asking how can the use of contraceptives for years can affect fertility?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. Of course, I'm not a medical doctor, so that's really important. A side note here, I approach it more from the psychological and mental health aspect. What I have, when you look in the research, in the literature, as far as I know, is that we don't find a difference between contraceptive users and non-users on fertility per se, but what you often see happening is that women start their contraceptives when they're just off or in puberty, basically at 15 or 16, and they use it until they want to get pregnant. So then they come off the pill, and then maybe they find issues related to their menstrual cycle or their hormones that come up that have been there all this time, but then get raised because they want to get pregnant. So it is really tied to taking the pill in that sense, because it feels like, hey, I haven't had these issues before, but they often were lingering under the surface and we just didn't know it yet. So that's often where this correlation comes from, but we don't really see a direct causal effect.
Well, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense.
I want to do a quick poll with everybody here, because we just released some information which I think most of us can relate to. So first of all, who of us started hormonal contraception in our teens? Raise your hand. Okay, yeah, we see digital hands. Okay, so
Yeah.
that is the reality for most our age, that we basically function on a synthetic way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. In the sense that we do suppress the cycle, because that's the whole biochemical mechanism that it works at, right? So you take this pill to suppress your menstrual cycle. That's the whole point of it. And if that's good or bad, that's still.
Yeah. And I'd love for us to cover and dive a little bit deeper into then, okay, for those women who are on contraceptives and those who are not, I think if I speak for myself and what I see around me in my circle is that people are starting to get off these, not only to get pregnant, but just because they realize I want a deeper connection with me and my body. But what have you found in terms of research is the difference between, let's cover mental health first. What are the main differences that you see?
Yeah, so the thing about mental health is that changes in mood are actually part of the leaflet of the side effects of the pill, for example, right? So it already says 1 in 10 women can experience these changes in mood. The issue there is that maybe it's not necessarily taken as seriously because a lot of people doubt that it's actually because of the hormones, and that's why it's maybe often put to the side. Basically, this whole field is super new, and it got this really big impulse from this paper from 2016 that uses this epidemiological research. So they basically included everyone from Denmark. I think it's really cool because they have information on everyone. And then they actually saw that the use of contraceptives increased your risk significantly of depression and even suicidality. So that caused this really big uproar and also an impulse to this field into, hey, we do see the difference between these contraceptive users and not users. And what I told you before, we know how much hormones can affect your mood. So it's not that strange to assume that there might be an effect there. But how much of it is actually because of the hormones directly, or is it just a group that already differs without the hormones being a part of that? Right. So, and it's pretty hard to research because you can't just give someone, well, they did that for a few studies. You would prefer to do a controlled trial where you give one group a sugar pill and one group the actual pill and then see what happens to really control for it. But it's a little unethical. And also these papers have had unintended pregnancies. And that's just really not part of the research behind it. But what we see is that there are more studies that have shown this effect on mood and even depression and anxiety. But there's an equal number of studies that don't show it, or a number of studies that show a positive effect on it. So there's not a definitive answer to that. Does the pill cause depression? Probably the consensus right now is probably not if we go look at the whole population. Where we're going more towards is that we know about this hormone field and we know about it through the entire lifespan. So also for the cycle, there's a subset of people that are really sensitive to hormone changes. And probably it accounts for those people. And those people have these certain risk factors that do really increase their chances of depression, of anxiety, and mental health issues. But that's likely to be for a subset and a smaller group of women. Just like the menstrual cycle, we do often notice a change, but it doesn't mean it really negatively affects us, except for this group of, for example, for menstrual dysphoric disorder that women can experience. So that is sort of the consensus that we're at now.
Yeah, and that piece of like individuality also makes sense, right? Like how sensitive is every single person towards that. And now that we've spoken a little bit about mental health, there's also different differences in terms of risk taking and behavioral patterns. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? Like what do we mean with risk taking? Is it just like I don't know, we're like more daredevil and like we'll jump out of a plane, or are like talk to us a little bit more about that.
I mainly have focused that on our last paper where we basically measured men and women every single day for 28 days. Every morning, we send out a prompt to say, hey, how you feel? And that was about mood, but also about, how impulsive do you feel and how do you say it, not closed off, but being more careful, go through life, but also your energy and your sex drive and your sleep and your appetite. And then we followed that throughout basically 20 days to capture an average cycle, and then compare that as well in oral contraceptive users and in men to see actually how much does that vary over time. So this part of it, what we know from the menstrual cycle is that actually during ovulation and during this testosterone rise, we do see an increase in impulsivity. And that can be really fun for some people, but for some people who really struggle with that emotion regulation part of it, that can also be a period of, I just don't feel like I have a control over myself in that sense. So it can go both ways, but we mostly see that with menstrual cycle. If we're talking about the pill and risk taking, I don't think we find such robust effects yet. We do see these differences between these groups and also measured that, for example, in a study I did in adolescence. So how does it work when you're taking the pill from a very early age, and how do your anxiety and depression, how does that develop over time? And we did see that the oral contraceptive users were a bit more risk takers, maybe because you have that sense of, I have this backup behind me, so I can go more out into the world and explore. And you also saw that, of course, using oral contraception at that young age comes with you probably being more sexually active and maybe having a tendency to be more risk-taking. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. So that's a good example of, is it the hormones or is it the behavior?
I love that. And you mentioned you also plotted against men. Can we get a scoop on what that means?
Yeah, we're writing it up. It hasn't been published yet. But what we saw, because this whole project started because we saw research in mice that showed that when they measured these outcome variables of their behavior that were related to hormones, they didn't really see a difference in the variation there. So, right, often women are excluded from this kind of research because they're too variable and they're too hard to measure because there's so much error and noise in their data. But actually what they saw is that how much they fluctuated over time was kind of the same. And that actually, because you have the menstrual cycle, which is a predictable pattern, we could explain more of the emotion and behavior when you take that into account compared to men whose testosterone fluctuates tremendously throughout the day and is very sensitive to external factors. And we also saw that in these two groups, we don't really see a difference in the variation of their emotion throughout these 28 days. And fun thing, I mentioned that in a workshop for consultants this morning, and the guys were like, nah, can't be. Are you sure? I was like, yeah, we really do see that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just as I think as women need to be educated a lot more about hormones and how it affects us, and the reason why we're doing all of these stuff, the same goes for men. Right? I remember explaining to my partner, he has a circadian rhythm. He's like, no, that's not true. Until he actually started learning a bit about this. So
yes, I always say being hormonal means being human. Like we're not, like you can't out-rationalize your biology. And We also know how hard it is to work against our biology. Like if you want to have a meeting at 2 a.m., you're working against your cortisol, which is really difficult to do. So why would you?
Good point. Question from Christina. Can you explain a little bit more about the injection type contraception? So I'm assuming, Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, that based on the type of hormones, does it have a different effect?
Yeah, because so it's very common post-pregnancy that they give you in the UK as you leave the war, they give you an injection hormone, an injection contraception, sorry, last 13 weeks. And I'd never had that before until I fell pregnant and then had the first child. And now obviously being pregnant the second time around, contraception is really big on my mind because we don't want any more kids for quite the near future. And therefore, if any at all. So my mind is prior to going into premenopause or whatever that may be, and is with the breastfeeding, what contraceptions to look at now that it is going to be potentially quite long term?
Yes, very good question, especially after pregnancy, because what worked for you before pregnancy might not work for you again after pregnancy. We see that these really big hormonal changes can really prime your brain somehow to the effect of hormones. We also see often that your PMS may be more severe after pregnancy, for example. So this is really, I think, a trial and error with your health provider and what works for you. Yeah, it's so hard to say that from where I'm sitting here. But I think the whole trial and error is so important, and also the realization of there's so many options out there. Just seeing what works for you at that point is what I would advise.
Annemarieke, actually, you mentioned testosterone, and usually when we're thinking about female hormones, we're talking about progesterone and estrogen, but we rarely talk about the testosterone because we usually attribute this to guys. And so I'm really curious, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, I love the testosterone talk. Also because your ovaries also produce testosterone, but testes in men, we see that testosterone gets actually converted into estrogen as well. So we all share the same hormones. Like talking about female sex hormone and male sex hormones is kind of reductive because we all share them. We just have them in different concentrations and in different rhythms, right? So in testosterone, it kind of works the same in men as in women. It's really important. It stimulates your reward center. So to feel motivation and to feel that sense of reward when you achieve something, but it also has a lot to do, but it can really influence your sex drive as well and your mood. So in that sense, testosterone is really essential in regulating those behaviors. Both physical, it's also involved in your muscle and bone density, but it does have a big behavioral component. And the interesting thing about oral contraceptives is that often what women also report is this reduction in sex drive. And we see actually that using a contraceptive pill reduces your free testosterone levels by about 60%. It's not that strange to have those effects. The issue there is that, again, these hormones are part of, I like to think of like psychological well-being as this big puzzle, and hormones are one of the puzzle pieces that fit into there. And for some people, they're really big, but for others, sometimes, your stressors in life, your family life, maybe your job and your living conditions can take precedence over that. But it is part of the puzzle, and if you miss it, you can really miss some really big changes and miss something that you can work towards. And I think testosterone is part of that. So sex drive, especially for women, is so multifactorial. So to reduce it only to your hormones, we often don't measure that big effects either. But if you're missing that already makes it harder, right? So if you're not considering that, you're just missing part of the puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to know that men also have estrogen. So we all have the same hormones, just in different combinations, which is really fascinating. Yeah. The female side, and the women, the men's side. So.
We can just agree that we're all hormonal. We're just hormonal in different ways, and it's not bad or good. It's different.
Yeah. And since I want to segue into stress and how stress affects our hormonal health, and with different contraceptives, that's also interesting because some of them are just progestin and some of them estrogen and progestin. So with different contraceptives, how that works.
Yes. So stress is a big thing, and that you already mentioned that with Rachel last time, which I really liked. Stress is the stress axis, what we call. So how the brain produces your stress hormone is in direct link with your hormone axis, because the same hormone glands produce or signal to your body to produce cortisol, but also signal your body to produce the sex hormones. And actually, cortisol, your stress hormone, is made from the same compounds as your sex hormones. And the thing about your body is that it always prefers survival over reproduction. So stress for your body has the same response. It doesn't matter if you're in front of a bear and you're afraid of being eaten, or if you're in front of your computer and need to reach a deadline for work. Like, your body doesn't know the difference. It has the same response to it. So if you are stressed, your cortisol needs to be made regardless of the other things. So your reproduction basically comes second. So your hormones can't do their jobs as well. So if you're already struggling with a drop in your hormones, for example, during your premenstrual week, that means that your stress responsivity or stress reactivity there is also affected because your hormones can't do their job anyway, right? So it's more important even to address your stress. And the interesting thing about contraceptives is, and we have known this ever since experimental psychologists have started doing stress experiments. So it's this really scary thing. So they put you basically as a participant, you walk into a room and then you see 3 people in lab coats, and then you need to prepare a speech without anything, and you have to prepare a 5-minute speech. You have 2 minutes to prepare, and then they make you count back from, 97 minus 3, and you have to keep doing -3, and then they tell you when you're wrong, so you need to start over again. And we know that that is such an uncomfortable experience for people that it activates this stress response. And what we see during these stress experiments, which have been done since the 60s or 70s, they already knew that when you have oral contraceptive users, they don't show this stress response. So this cortisol peak that we see about 30 minutes after this happens, they don't have that. And the idea is that their cortisol levels are kind of stable level and high, so they can't peak anymore. And the solution to that was just to exclude them from the studies and to not really go into, hey, why is that? And is that a good or bad thing? We still don't know that, right? So we don't really see, we know the biology is different, and we don't know if that, well, we can infer from that can affect you, but we don't know, we don't see that big of a difference. So we do know most people's brains are quite dynamic and flexible and can deal with that. But you can imagine if you don't have that stress response, that can affect you, and maybe even in the long term.
That's such a shame that they were excluded from the studies.
Yeah, there was no question asked. It was just, we just don't. It's just part of the protocol that we don't include these contraceptive users.
That's probably in the first place why women were not included in clinical studies, because we are hormonal. So that's just too difficult to research.
Yeah, rather than being like, hey, if we find out more about it, we actually reduce what we call error in our studies. So we will understand more about men if we kind of separate that, and if we more understand. So your results will be more valid if you take this into account. And that part just hasn't really clicked yet, but I hope it will more. And but the stress, what a study from 2 years ago from Rotterdam, from the Netherlands, actually showed that when you have an hormonal IUD, you show an increased even stress response of your cortisol compared to menstrual cycle, people on their menstrual cycle. So there's this complete opposite response in IUD users. What that means, we don't know yet.
That's really fascinating. And the studies, the work that you do is so important, because we want to understand what is in our bodies. And unfortunately, when we go to the doctor's offices, doctors don't have this information. They don't tell us anything.
Exactly. And it's still such a young field. And Rachel will also recognize this. I feel like all the researchers here kind of try to find out by trial and error that most of the protocols that we have just don't really fit into women's health and bodies, and how participants are recruited and how you deal with that. It brings about, I was always very envious to my colleagues who were just looking at, for example, the visual system, and they could just grab a few people off the street and just put them in their chair for an hour, and that was done after 30 days. And it took me about 3 years to find the participants and put them in the right phase of their cycle, and then make sure that we could measure all of that. So it took a bit more effort. That doesn't mean we don't need to do it.
Yeah, it's just we need to know this, and it just needs to be accurate. It cannot be just done right away. Women, it's a little bit longer, but we're half of the world at the end.
Exactly, and it's such a shame, because if you don't consider this, then, like I said, your results probably don't really make sense, right? If you're just generalizing it to everyone, you can't extrapolate it to, it's not a general effect. You're kind of averaging out all of these effects. So are they really true?
We have a few questions from the audience that were submitted to us, so I'm gonna read some of them. So the first one, what should you track if regular bleeding is absent when you're on contraceptive?
On your oral contraceptive, the tracking itself, so you don't have that menstrual cycle, right? So you don't really have the luteal phase or the follicular phase that you can really equate to. The interesting thing there to track, and you don't have ovulation. So for example, if you track your temperature, you won't find that increase. What would be really interesting to track is if you have a pill inactive week. So often on the pill, you have 21 days of active pill intake, and then you have a 7-day period where you stop the pill and you have this bleeding, this withdrawal bleed. It's not really equatable to a menstruation, by the way. And what we see is that basically what we know, and what I've also seen in my studies, is that the effect we see from the pill on your psychological well-being is that the variation that you experience during menstrual cycle, also in your emotions, is kind of stabilized. So I call it also this blunting. So the same thing that it does to your hormones, it also does to your psychological well-being. And for some people, that can be really nice. So if you have really these issues with PMS and find yourself really, really affected by your hormones in a negative way, and the positive don't outweigh the negatives there, then having this contraceptive pill can feel quite nice because you have this stability, you have this ability to maybe feel more in control of your emotions. But then with those people, what can happen is in your pill inactive week, when you stop taking the pill, so you don't have these synthetic hormones anymore, that your natural hormones just kind of go up again. And that's when their symptoms come back. So that can be part of maybe what you can track. And often, so people kind of have this like, oh, I just do this. And then when you think back, you can be like, hey, wait, actually, I stopped taking the pill 2 days ago. So this makes sense why I'm feeling different or worse, and that can help you feel some control over your emotional life as well. So that could be one way to track.
And probably also sleep and eating.
Yes, all the psychological well-being.
Exactly. I want to open up to our participants for the questions. Please put them in the chat or unmute yourself. I have a few more questions for you that came prior from the audience. And one of the questions is, what's the difference between the hormones substances used in contraceptives and HRT, which is hormone replacement therapy?
They also have, it depends, you can have a progesterone only, or often there's a combination in your HRT, so your hormone suppletion therapy when you're, for example, in perimenopause. The nice thing about the hormone suppletion therapy, especially these days, is that they have made to become more and more like your natural hormones. So the idea there is that a lot of the contraceptive side effects may be because you give these synthetic versions of these hormones, and that can have a bunch of different effects that you don't really account for. So they can bind to a bunch of other receptors that a natural version would not do. So you can really target the source of your symptoms better on natural hormones. The problem with these natural hormones is that they're much easier for your body to break down. So that's why you have to take a pill every day, because it's quite hard to suppress your hormones and quite hard to actually not have an ovulation. So we're not there yet to have a functional oral contraceptive, for example, just of these natural hormones, which I do think would be probably a lot of people would tolerate much better.
That makes a lot of sense, because I'm on HRT and my body accepts this. So I can understand why the contraceptives that will include the natural hormones would be more acceptable for the body.
Exactly. And I think we can take some more knowledge from this HRT to contraceptives, because HRT also, maybe you've experienced that it really differs per person, what the absorption rate is, for example, how high this should be, what the perfect combination is. And I feel like there's a lot more personalized efforts rather than, you just have this pill and then maybe in 5 years, women change their contraceptive pill. And there are different options with different types of progestins, with different doses of hormones. So I think we can take some example from hormone suppletion therapy, for sure.
Exactly. It's personally calibrated. And so maybe the future for contraceptives is also personal calibration of hormones.
Yes, I think that's what we should all work towards, for sure.
That's amazing. Okay, so another question is there even menstrual syncing when you are on hormonal contraceptives?
Other than the pill inactive week and maybe the first few days that you're back on it where you can find symptoms. Other than that, I don't feel there's a lot of hormone syncing you can do because there's just not as much variation in your hormones. If you're on other types of hormones, we know that, for example, your hormonal IUD and the other progestin-only option, so the implants, the injection, your ovulation can still occur. So you might still have some cycles. The problem with that, we also don't know how they look, and they're really hard to track because sometimes you bleed, sometimes you don't bleed, and that's not really a good indicator if you've gone through a cycle on a contraceptive. So for example, for I think the hormonal IUD, you start with about 70% of your cycles that can be ovulatory, so ovulation happened and you've gone through a proper cycle, then 30% is suppressed, and then over the years, because you often use it for a longer period of time, that reduces to 40 to 30%. So it's really unpredictable when you actually experience a cycle, when you don't, and how they look. Are they longer? Are they shorter? Do they have higher hormone peaks? These are all things that we don't know yet. Nobody's measured it yet. So we have no idea. So there's a lot of ground to cover before we can put that to use in a more practical sense.
Wow, there is so much ahead of us, right? So much research that needs to be done. So
Yes.
we know. And you mentioned IUD, like Mirena, it only works with progestin. It doesn't have estrogen.
No, and you do, of course, have the copper spiral, the copper IUD. So that's non-hormonal. So the idea there is that it doesn't affect your hormones directly as much.
And then, of course, it's all based on how we feel. So when we go to the doctor, it's the same with hormonal replacement therapy. You need to let them know how you feel. And maybe this is not the right contraception for you and needs to change to something else.
Exactly. And maybe in that sense, especially when you're trying out contraceptive options, that's when tracking can become really, really important, right? If you already go to the doctor and you can present them with either an Excel sheet like Nathalie had, or with these apps that you have, that you can be like, hey, this was my functioning and how I felt before I went on it. This is the date I got on it. Look at how the scores have changed. And also that will help a lot for your own health literacy and health knowledge to see, hey, how do I actually feel, rather than as people are really hard at recalling how we felt. We know that from this from our field. So we prefer to ask people, how do you feel now? They're much better at that. So you can take that to your advantage and then have the evidence right there also when you go to a GP in the Netherlands or to your gynecologist, and that might help them as well with advising you on stuff.
Absolutely. And it's almost like the concept that you're in charge of your own health because you know your symptoms better than anybody else.
Yes. And if you have it on black and white, that will maybe help in advocating for yourself.
Yeah. And just the concept that your doctor might not know everything. You know better your symptoms than anybody else. And it's all up to you to bring this to your doctor so it can be, something can be changed. So we have a question from Jan, and the question is, what are the main discoveries that you have found through your studies? Like things like that we can take into consideration in our daily cycles that might change and improve the way we understand ourselves during the different periods?
Great question. So how I started off my studies was more experimental, like Rachel talked about last time as well. I compared women in their luteal phase with women in their mid-follicular phase. And then I found out there's way more phases of the cycle that can actually affect you. So it's kind of oversimplifying the cycle. So I have personally what I found was really cool is that your menstruation on its own is kind of its separate phase because of more the physical symptoms. And then you have this mid-follicular phase with your estrogen rises, which is when actually estrogen helps in creating connections between your neurons. So that's the time to learn stuff, to start off new projects, for example. And then ovulation indeed is a sense where you're more personable, you're more social. That's the time you should go out on a date. And then the luteal phase often gets a really bad rep. But what I saw is that there's not just this premenstrual phase, which is when these hormones drop. What we kind of see based on the clinical literature is that is the period where symptoms are more present that go more internal. So you have the anxiety, so you have the depression, you have the reduced confidence, all this serotonin functioning that differs, your dopamine levels that drop. we actually see during the progesterone surge that comes before that. So in your mid-luteal phase, that's when your behavior, at least the clinical studies show that symptoms occur more like irritability, like the mood swings. That's more specific to that surge, which is really interesting. So it's this progesterone surge that causes that or is associated with that. So then you can notice more your irritability and in social situations where you get more easily triggered. And what I've kind of taken away from that is that these hormones kind of act as this, how do you say it? This vergrootglas, the
spotlight, like spotlight.
Yeah, like a spotlight. Stuff that is already happening in your life, right? So this mid-luteal phase might just probably means that your boundaries are just a lot more strict. And when people come close to it, you just respond to it with a bit more fire and a bit more passion. But that doesn't mean that those boundaries don't exist in the other parts of your cycle. It just kind of highlights it plants these like red flags, like, hey, I should pay more attention to this also in the rest of my life. And then, for example, your follicular phase highlights aspects that go really well for you and stuff that really shoots up that dopamine and shoots up that serotonin that you could actually use when you feel worse, for example, in your premenstrual phase. And we do see that people have very different patterns of what they are sensitive to, right? So you have this PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, where most people have this premenstrual symptom drop during they really struggle with, but other people really struggle with that peak in progesterone. And we see different profiles for different people. So what I take from this research is to really get to know yourself. So what I explained as well, it's often based on this average woman with an average cycle. And that doesn't exist. Like that person does not exist because it's all averaged, right? So because there's so much variability and it's also really hard to capture as a researcher because we often like our averages. I don't think that's the right way to study it, but that's a whole side note. But that also means that you really have to track it for yourself, understand your own patterns and understand that they might change from one cycle to the next. But these are all maybe ideas for you to be able to explain what you experience. Women share that. I think that's really powerful.
And also to normalize this for ourselves, because as women, we're so hard on ourselves. Why don't we have energy? Why we didn't finish this or we didn't finish that? Once we understand our own flows, ebbs and flows of our energy, we might not be as hard on ourselves.
Yes, exactly. And then it doesn't just happen to you. You have this sense of control.
Exactly. This is your body, right? And it's not separate from here. It's one.
Yes, it's a direct influence. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anyone else? Jan, did that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions? I actually, please guys, don't hesitate, unmute yourself or put in the chat. There is one more question that that came along, and the question is: are there any hormonal contraceptives out there that don't affect us negatively? Or in other words, are there a contraceptive that maybe one contraceptive is better than another? But I know it's individual, but
yes, the perfect contraceptive, it doesn't exist. Yeah, it's a really maybe unfulfilling answer, but with stuff like contraception, it's so personalized and it's basically counting the positives against the negatives, right? People don't experience, for example, the menstrual cycle as the way that they feel the best or that works for them at that point. They much rather have the safety and not have to think about possibly becoming pregnant. So that brings about its positives as well. It can really change from one year to the next and one stage of your life to the next. So there is no one set contraceptive that works for you. It's all about how do you function at your baseline? How do you already experience these symptoms and how hormone sensitive are you? And then, for example, with this oral contraceptive pill, there's a ton of options. One that might work for you, one that doesn't. So it's really for yourself, for individualized, what are the pros and cons? What is really important for me in my life? What is the priority? Is my priority not getting pregnant? Is my priority getting more into touch with my body? Then you have to weigh those against each other. So it's not that hormones, natural or synthetic, are good or bad, right? It just, if it does it work for you or doesn't it? I think that's a better question. Yeah.
And probably at different stages of your life, you also might need different contraceptives.
For sure. Yeah.
Facing your own symptoms, and that's what you're tracking as well.
Yes, exactly.
I have a question, sorry, really quickly. Like, since you started your studies, have you seen an increase in in the way like people talk about this, like more knowledge, more interest, or maybe in schools, universities, talking more about this?
Yes, it's really nice because this project kind of started, especially in the Netherlands. You can count on a few like fingers how many people actually are involved in this, and you really see an increase not just in researchers that are interested in, but also in grants that are given to it, because that's often where the problem lies, right? You need to get money to study this, but also in if I talk about this, how much women recognize it and want to talk about it. The issue here, what I find is that it's really nice to be in these kind of circles where it's normal to talk about, and the taboo and shame is not there, or is very little there. But then, for example, this morning when I was in a room with both male and female consultants, I had to drag stuff out of there, and you could really still feel this sense of like, ooh, this is tricky to talk about. So there is this sense of like, it creates so much more openness and there's so much more readiness to talk about it, but we're not there yet. And there's also, because I wanted to do a study where I researched in adolescent girls who were starting the pill, and I wanted to measure them before and after and what happened, because we know adolescence may be one of the risk factors for developing these mood symptoms after oral contraceptives. But I tried for 3 years to get participants. I couldn't get them because often schools and parents were like, this is really private information that you're going to ask about. We don't want to give any statements if we join your research by that. So I really still am struggling with that sense of privacy and taboo. And so that's still there.
Thank you.
I think this ties in very well, Annemarieke, to a next topic that we're going to cover in our speaker series that addresses actually psychological safety for women and for women on the workplace. And you're absolutely right to point out that shame and like not feeling safe stops us women from learning new things, from researching new things, from changing the ways in which we do things. I'm going to put the link to the next speaker series in the chat for those of you who want to join, because what we'll also cover is psychological safety and stress, and then also at the workplace, because there's a lot of internalized gender roles at play that can fuel additional stress in women. I don't know how many of you work in organizations. I know that some of you are individual founders, like you have your own organization, but this is a real challenge. And from what I'm hearing, Annemarieke, is that you see this in real life.
Yes. It's also this idea of, if we acknowledge these hormonal effects, we play into the stereotype of the hormonal woman, right? And how do we broach that topic? So there's still a lot of room to win into acknowledging our differences actually creates so much more control and so much more power and opportunities. And that's a message that needs repeating.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're almost the hour. I'm just going to open it one more time if somebody has a question. If not, just know always that you can reach out to Annemarieke directly, can they? Or connect with you on LinkedIn if you want to drop in your details. If not, we look very much forward to seeing you guys in the next expert series talk. And actually, to give you a little bit of insight of what we're doing in the background, because you mentioned it, Annemarieke, that I tracked it on paper. We're actually working on developing something for you so that you can start tracking. It's without the apps and without the consent and like worrying about where your data is going to be. It's just for you, and to start getting insight into your own cycle. And then from those different angles that we're speaking about, from the biological perspective, from the psychological, and from the leadership at work, how can we use it? Rachel, thank you so much for sharing. I learned a few things and I loved hearing about this, and you sparked a new research idea. Can't wait.
Love to hear
it.
Yeah, Marieke, thank you so much. And I think the first step is to bring awareness to this. I think that's the first step for all of us. We might not be yet able to change our workload at particularly corporate level yet, but we need to know this. And there are more and more women who are coming to the top. So if these women are aware of this, then we can change it together. And it's a process, but the first thing is your research. It's so important to have this.
Yeah, and thanks for giving it a platform.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. We're going to be closing this up, and we hope to see you in our next segment, as Nathalie mentioned, on psychology.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Annemarieke.
Take care. Bye, ladies. Have a good
Thank
rest
you.
of your weekend.